Well, I want to talk to you today about a word that I'm afraid is near and dear to your life, but one that you would much rather not have near and dear to your life, and that is the word chaos. Seems appropriate as we're heading into the school year and imagining new schedules and new lives that we'll talk about chaos a little bit and maybe even how God works through chaos. I want to tell you the story about my teen years, but I feel like I should probably apologize to Pastor Jesse before I tell this story. You got a lot of your teens in here, and they may get some bad ideas, so please forgive me already. I was a bit of a rambunctious teenager. I think I've hinted at that a little bit. My mother-in-law was my youth leader, and she still to this day says that I was the worst teenager she ever had. And so some of these stories, are a little bit hard to tell 20 years on. But I was at teen camp when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And how it used to work back in the day in the Church of the Nazarene is that the college would send their best music students off to the Nazarene teen camps, and they would do all the music for camp during the week. And so we were in the Olivet region in the Midwest when I was in high school. I lived in Wisconsin, and so this group would come from Olivet Nazarene University up to camp every year, and they were called the Olivetians. Now, they were, of course, made up of brilliant music students, many of whom would turn out to be pastors and missionaries in the church. And so these were fine, upstanding individuals. I was probably not a fine, upstanding individual. And so me and my buddies, all rambunctious in our middle school years, we would always get into things at camp to make camp a little more interesting. And so we started in on this Olivet group from day one, telling them on the last night at camp, we were going to break into their cabin and have a pillow fight with them. Now, that doesn't probably seem like too big a deal, except that this was a lot of growing boys with a lot of aggression that they were still trying to get out, and that includes the college students. And so they started talking back to us, and so all week we would threaten back and forth this last night pillow fight on Thursday night. And so sure enough, Thursday night came at the end of the week, and midnight, lights out happened, and we broke out of our cabin after lights out. And we made our way with our pillows quietly over to where these fine, upstanding college students were staying. We knocked in their door and went in, and they were expecting us. And so we didn't get them out of bed, but instead we kind of ran right into each other, and there were pillows everywhere. And this went on for about 15 minutes of adolescent boys and just barely post-adolescent boys just pounding the snot out of each other. And it was chaos. I mean, there were just young men everywhere whacking each other with pillows. And it was extended chaos until finally we realized that someone was hurt. This is probably not that surprising, right? And in particular, this person that was hurt was the one who was going the craziest. And now they were dizzy and disoriented. So what I'm saying is this innocent pillow fight ended with an ambulance being called. And the ambulance ended up coming for a concussed young man who has now grown up to be one of our best missionaries in the Church of the Nazarene. Yay. And so my night ended at about 5 a.m. with the director of the camp being called from his home in the middle of the night to interrogate us as to whether or not we actually attempted to hurt this young man, because he had paperwork waiting for him in the morning. And so threats were given, fear was placed within us. There was much yelling. I'm not sure if there was more chaos in the middle of the pillow fight or in the aftermath of the pillow fight. But that night, of which I slept nothing, was a night of chaos and craziness. And it seemed at its height that people were deeply injured or that there was going to be serious trouble for those who were accused of starting the fight. But what's interesting is for all of the chaos and all of the craziness, everyone turned out okay. No one was seriously hurt. No one got in serious trouble. That's kind of the way that chaos goes so often, is that in the middle of the chaos, you can feel all sorts of emotions, fear, anxiety, wondering where this is going to go, but so often the chaos ends up declining into calm. Another time I remember chaos was my wife and I ended up, fortunately, our schedule worked that we were able to be in St. Louis on Game 5 of the World Series in 2005. On that night, we needed a rain cancellation to happen on Friday so that we could go see a game on Sunday, as I recall it. And that rain happened, and we ended up being in town, and we ended up getting tickets to get into Game 5 of the World Series, of which the Cardinals won the game. Now, it was the Cardinals and the Tigers. I don't particularly care for or about either team, so we were vaguely rooting for the Cardinals just to see a World Series trophy. And so the Cardinals won, and we got to see them receive the World Series trophy and do all of the interviews. And we finally left the stadium about an hour after the game, and everything was calming down in the stadium. But everything was not calming down in the city. If you've ever been around a city right after the city has won a major championship, there is chaos in the streets. And so when we had walked simply and easily into the stadium, like every game we had ever been into our life, walking out of the stadium was really quite different. There was now a mob in the city. People had gotten in their cars and driven downtown and were sitting on top of their cars, and there was honking, and there was busyness, and there was no way for us to even move without shoulder to shoulder touching complete and perfect strangers. In the middle of it, everyone was happy, but not everyone, but many had also had a few beers to celebrate that night. And so there was a bit of a hint of drunkenness in the air. There was a hint of celebration, and we came to realize, my family, my very sober family and I, walking through all this, not caring at all that the Cardinals had won the World Series, that mobs can quickly turn from joy into anger and chaos. And we began to think we ought to get back to our hotel before that happens. And so we worked our way through that with just a little bit of fear in our heart as the crowd was right on the edge of happy and chaos. And we, of course, got out of there without any trouble, but mobs can turn into trouble pretty quick. And fortunately, nothing happened that night, but I know that in 2004, when my Red Sox won a World Series, people went out to celebrate and ended up dead. Mobs can turn into danger in quick happening. We're going to read about a mob in the book of Acts in a little bit. But I also want to talk about chaos to you a little bit, because while this mob may be distant enough that you don't feel that sense of chaos, my suspicion is that many of us have come today with what we could define as chaos in our life. We may have a sense of feeling that something isn't going the way we planned it, or that there's a certain unknown in our future that is turning our stomach just a little bit. And so while there is this mob scene that seems distant and historic that isn't quite connecting with us, I would invite you to think about the chaos in your life that you're harboring or concerning yourself with. Anxiety that is riddling you, an unknown future, or being in the midst of trouble and a struggle that you can name that is very real in the moment. There is a chaos theory out there called the butterfly effect. Have you ever heard of the butterfly effect before? Let me see your hands if you've heard this before. All right, so I don't need to explain it too much, but the basic theory is that when a butterfly flaps its wings, that the change in atmosphere, by the time that change reaches its way around the world, it could be a hurricane. Another way to talk about this that scientists talk about is that you can't go to a beach without removing even a grain of sand, without fundamentally changing the scope of the way that the earth is. The idea is that very, very little changes can change the whole of an environment, and so that little things make big differences and big changes. Paul, in our story today, seems to be making a little change, but it makes a huge difference. And when we read the text, we should confess that our bias going into this story is that we're on Team Paul. All right? When Paul shows up in Ephesus and starts preaching the gospel and people are starting winning to the faith, we as Christian folks say, "Go Paul." We're on Team Paul. We're siding with the gospel. We want to see people changed. But Paul's fundamental change of the city of Ephesus is making a difference for people who are making money off the way that things are. It's changing things for people who have societal structures and friendships and expectations of schedules and what we do and who we are. And with each conversion that's happening in Ephesus, the very fabric of the way that the city works is changing and undoing until it reaches the point of a fever pitch. And so while we're on Team Paul, anyone who is rejecting the gospel sees Paul as a civic problem. And so they don't like him. They're upset at what he's doing. And Paul has a way in the book of Acts of upsetting as many people as those whose lives he changes. Paul enters into the town of Ephesus, which is a central, strategic, financial hub of the Roman Empire. This is on his second missionary journey, and he does as he typically does. He walks to the synagogue to find his fellow Jews, and he begins to explain to them how it is that Jesus is the Messiah that they waited for. Now, sometimes this comes with just incredible results, but many times the local Jews get frustrated with him and don't see what he's talking about. That is the case here in Ephesus. So after just a little while walking into the synagogue, 3 months we're told in Acts chapter 19, 3 months, he doesn't really persuade many of them, and they become obstinate and angry at him. So he makes the choice to go to just a meeting hall in town and talk to the Gentiles. Now, the Gentiles don't know Yahweh. They don't know about the expectant Messiah. They are pagan. If you studied Roman or Greek mythology in your middle school English class or your high school English class, those are the gods that they believe create and order the universe and also order chaos in the world. And so they are living on a fundamentally different plane than Paul is. But the Jews reject him, and so Paul starts talking to the pagans. And they jump on the story of the gospel in near record numbers in Paul's ministry. Ephesus becomes one of the key churches, even after Paul's death, in the spread of the Christian gospel and also the structure of the church that we know today. Ephesus is key. And it's because among these pagan people, they are receiving the gospel in incredible ways. And what's amazing, I've talked a fair amount, at least I hope I've really nailed this point to you, that in the book of Acts, those who are filled by the Spirit don't just worship Jesus, but they become like Jesus. And so the key players of Acts do things that ring to the story of the gospel when Jesus was walking around Israel. And that is the case in Ephesus as well. Paul is so filled with the Spirit in Ephesus that people begin to bring their sick and their dying, hoping that they can just touch Paul's clothes or that Paul's shadow will go past them or that Paul will pray for them. And people are being healed in incredible ways. Paul is carrying on the exact ministry of Jesus Christ. He is not like Christ in a philosophical manner, but he is physically the embodiment of the ministry of Christ carried out through the church. The things that Jesus did, Paul is empowered to do as well. And so news gets out that sick are being healed and that miracles are being made, and people keep bringing and gathering around Paul. It gets to the point that those in Ephesus who practice magic are recognizing the emptiness of their magic. What's fascinating about ancient magic is that in some ways it's kind of hard to see the difference between Paul healing the sick and people doing incantations that create magical moments. So why is Paul's act of the mysterious okay, but the magician's act not okay? And it seems the only difference is that Paul is not leveraging this mystical Jesus, this out-of-body experience Jesus, this Lord of all resurrected Jesus for his own name and his own gain. It's that he wants to make Jesus known. And so it's in Paul's relationship with Jesus Christ in particular that Jesus is becoming famous among the Ephesians. And on the other hand, the magicians are leveraging some other power in order to make their own name famous. And so these magicians become convicted of their own power, and they take all of their magical tools and books and spell books and bring them to Paul, and they light a giant bonfire and they throw it all in. That's a wild story. The very fabric of Ephesian society is being uprooted by the way the gospel is spreading. And for us as Christians, we would say, praise God, this is good news. The order of this world needs to be upset. But when the order of this world is upset, there are those who are profiting and comfortable in the order of this world. We're very upset when the order of this world is upset. And so the story we're going to read today, I've set the scene for you, is the response to the order being upset. And so we're going to read Acts chapter 19, verses 23 to 41. And I'm going to invite you to stand with me. The words will be on the screen here. I'll remind you again that when I'm done, I'm going to say, this is the word of the Lord, and you'll respond, thanks be to God. Here we go, verse 23. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He called them together along with the workmen of related trades and said, "Men, you know we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here from Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is a danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Soon, the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Articus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man in the theater. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some people were shouting one thing, some another. That's supposed to be funny. No? Nothing for you? Okay. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. Did that do it for you? No? That's pretty funny, guys. Tough crowd this morning. All right. The Jews pushed Alexander to the front, and some of the crowd shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Men of Ephesus, doesn't all of the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to be quiet and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of today's events. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it." Still not funny? Okay. After he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Sometimes we're not conditioned to read the Bible as funny, sacred, and this is a funny story, and it's meant to be funny. The opposition rises up against Paul and his disciples and what's happening in the church. And chaos comes of it, legitimate chaos, because Paul is undercutting the very fabric of what Ephesus understands itself to be as a city. It is the home of the Temple of Artemis, which the Temple of Artemis is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This place, this structure, is no small deal in the ancient world. And it is central to their economy. It is central to their understanding of who they are. It is central to their religious experience. Taking any kind of shot at Artemis is undoing the fabric of Ephesus as the people know it. Artemis was a Greek goddess. She was the daughter of Zeus, the defender of purity. She was understood to be vengeful. She was virginal. She was depicted as a young, beautiful huntress. She always had a bow and arrow. Think ancient Merida, if you've seen the movie Brave. This is who Artemis was, and she was celebrated across the entire world. But in particular, the people of Ephesus understood themselves to be the guardian of her story. And so, when Paul is inviting people to see one true God, when Paul is turning their eyes off the stories of the myths of the ancient world and seeing that God is active and alive, that there is one God named Yahweh who has sent his son Jesus for the sake of the world, that sins would be forgiven and we could be made right with God. People were attracted to this story, but there was an underlying narrative, is the old narrative of who they were. And people were now upset that their trade was in danger. Many of the people who used to buy their silver Artemis statues made of metal, that was a dying industry now. And Demetrius could recognize it. He could see it coming, and he had anxiety about it. And so he started riling up the crowd. And when you rile up a crowd can rile up a crowd, and a crowd can rile up a crowd. And before long, we're told that everyone in the city is screaming and yelling about their identity. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And we're told that many people started screaming even though they had no idea why. Because this is what mobs and chaos does. It grows and it grows and it expands and it expands. And it gains itself bandwagons to the point that we're told here that people were screaming and they didn't even know why they were screaming. But we are a communal people. We join in. We get excited even if we're not excited because there's excitement around us. And the chaos builds to the point that it becomes a mob, dangerous in the center of the city. Paul, who may not have been as good with words as he thinks he is, thinks that he is the solution to the problem. This is also supposed to be funny. If you were to carry on reading to the next story, it's actually, I'm not going to preach on this, but it's my favorite story in the whole book of Acts. I absolutely love the story of Eutychus. Do you guys know this story at all? Paul goes to his next town, Troas. He's preaching. He's just going to be there a short time. And so he feels like he needs to preach all night long. Don't you wish you had a pastor like that? He preaches... Paul preaches all night long, and to the point that this man named Eutychus, who's sitting in the window on the second floor, falls asleep. And when he falls asleep, he falls out the window to his death. And Paul is kind of alarmed that his preaching is now killing people. And so he runs outside and prays over him, and Eutychus comes back to life. And Paul looks around, he probably checks his watch and sees that it's 4 a.m. And he thinks, well, I'm not done yet. Let's go back upstairs and preach some more. If people are falling out of windows because of my preaching, I think I'm going to call it a night. But Paul carries on. He keeps going. Paul, this same guy who's sending people out of windows because he preaches so long, thinks he's going to be the solution. But everyone is begging him, Paul, don't go. Paul, don't go in. It's going to lead to your death. You're the one who's caused this problem. Don't go in there. Don't go in there. And so what ends up happening is an actual local person who understands the customs and the laws gets up and he makes a basic case to the city. Hey guys, we have no legal bearing to be here screaming. If anyone's going to get arrested, it's going to be us, and we won't all fit in the city jail. So if you have a problem with Paul or any of the people of this Christian way, just file a lawsuit and do it the right way. And the mob disbands. It's kind of this story that kind of shoots up to a fevered pitch and then just peters out a little bit. I really love this story. I think it's funny. I think it's chaotic. It doesn't have any kind of real resolution to it, which I kind of dig a little bit. But I want to say this to you, and this is really where I want to land in this text, is at the height of the fever pitch of this story in Ephesus comes on the response of God doing incredible work in Ephesus. God is doing amazing things. And yet, even when God is near and doing amazing things, it doesn't keep stressful things out of our lives. In fact, sometimes it can invite new stress. And so we have a way of interpreting our stress and our chaos in our life by saying, "Where are you, God? Why are you letting this happen to me?" But when we look at the text with honest eyes throughout the scripture, we see so often that the world is fighting against what God is doing in our lives. And sometimes the chaos that's coming up against us isn't God at all, but it's a result of an undoing of the fabric of the world that the world likes, because God is so at work in our life. The chaos comes from the world, not from God. And here's the thing, this story reaches this fever pitch where everyone is afraid. They're terrified of their lives. It feels like violence is coming. Have you been there before? And the amazing thing is, in the middle of the chaos, we start strategizing and we start thinking like Paul, well, I'm just going to fix this on my own. But the thing about it is that God works in mysterious ways. He puts his words in someone who isn't even his disciples' mouth. In the height of the chaos, which feels like it's on the very edge of breaking into violence, just peters out. It just peters out. So the God who's making great things happen in their life and in their church doesn't seem to be the one who's creating the chaos. But as the chaos rises, God is working on the back end to just peter out the chaos. My biggest struggle in my Christian life has been worry. You know when Jesus says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself? Even when I was like a preteen, 11 and 12 years old, I used to tell Jesus with all the fervor that I could muster that he had no idea what it was like to be a middle schooler in America. You been there before? Like, I would read that text almost daily or weekly, and I just couldn't understand what Jesus was talking about at all. Do not worry about tomorrow. You got to give me a break. Do you know what tomorrow has? Has mean kids, and it has tests, and it has homework. Give it chores. Don't worry about tomorrow. We have a way of inviting worry into our life when we serve a Lord who tells us to not worry. And here's the thing, just like in the story in the text today, if we would just give ourselves the responsibility of being faithful to what God has called us to do and put the results and the future in the hands of God, we will find that the most chaotic moments of our life, even if we're in the middle of the fever pitch moment, will so often peter out because God is working on our behalf, not fighting against us. And so I don't know what kind of chaos or frustration or hurt you come here today. I know there are so many in our church who have diagnoses out of their control. They have kids who aren't behaving or living the way we've imagined. People here with loved ones who have drug and alcohol habits, home problems, job problems, recent deaths, shocking diagnoses, and health problems. I know that there are many in this place today who feel like they're at the fever pitch of chaos. And my heart hurts with you. But I want you to know that this is not God working against you. God is not working against you. God is working for you. And you may not see the hand of God until the fever pitch peters out. And waiting and patience and avoiding worry and anxiety is a hard Christian discipline. But I want you to invite you to see in this story today that the resolution came from a surprising place and that God worked through surprising people. God is not working against you. God is not the source of your chaos. God is not fighting against you, but rather God is fighting for you. And so one day, you will look back on the moments of chaos. Or maybe you could even look back on the stories of chaos that have been in your past. And so often in the middle of the fever pitch, we turn into hysterical people, matching the hysteria of the world around us. But God has a way of petering out the struggle. God has a way of entering into our chaos and working on our behalf. And it's so often easier to see it when the chaos dissipates and disappears that we can look back and say, whoa, the hand of God was upon me every step of the way. And so if you feel today like your story is that of chaos, if you feel like life is at a fever pitch and you're out of control, that may all be true. But God is working just as like he was in Ephesus in the midst of that fever pitch. God is working to bring order and hope and calm and healing for you. I hope this promise means something to you today. We're going to sing a song about our wellness, that it is well with my soul, right? That's our song. And if that's your prayer, that you yearn for it to be well with your soul, I'd invite you to come and pray. You're welcome to come and pray and to seek the face of God in the midst of your chaos, or your disorder, or your struggle. God is near, even when he feels far. So let's sing this song. For some of us, it'll be a song of praise and thanksgiving that God has ordered the chaos of our past. For others, it'll be an invitation and a reminder that God can order the chaos of our now. Would you stand with me and sing?